A Flash in the Dark, Chapter 43, Red. I knew you'd be coming for me sooner or later. The voice echoed through the painting-strewn apartment. Barry couldn't quite pinpoint the source. I saw you at the bank. The way I turned those people against each other, it made you angry. Barry whirled and spotted him standing in the shadows. She raced to him, snagged him by the collar, and bodily slammed him into the fireplace. He had been wearing sunglasses when she'd snagged him by the shirt, but somewhere between there and the fireplace they had flown off. His eyes were glowing bright red. Barry felt her muscles seize and stumbled backward. She couldn't move for a moment as she tried to shake off the feeling of something creeping into her brain. Distantly, she heard someone speak. Have some real anger. By the time Barry managed to shake herself out of whatever had just happened, Bivolo was gone. Barry shook her head and raced back to Star Labs. Caitlin insisted on a full workup when Barry got back to the lab. Apparently, she'd gone quiet for about 5 minutes before she ran back to Star Labs. Felicity fussed, handing Caitlin various tools. Caitlin shone a light into Barry's eyes, and she sighed. Your retina and cornea appear undamaged, she stated. Barry nodded. I told you I'm fine, Barry insisted. Felicity stepped forward. What do you remember? The blonde asked. Barry shook her head and ran a hand through her hair. He looked me in the eye, and I saw a flash of red. Then he was gone, Barry explained. Cisco stepped forward. And you have absolutely no desire to go MMA on anyone, he asked hesitantly. Barry shook her head. She did feel a touch on edge, but that always happened after a fight, especially when she'd lost. She was still internally kicking herself for that. No, nothing, she said, shaking her head again. Felicity turned to Caitlin. So it looks like we were right about how Bivolo is causing the rage, she said, nodding to Caitlin. Barry hopped off the table. Clearly his powers don't affect me, she insisted. Caitlin set down her light. It was still stupid of you to go after him alone. You take too many risks. No matter how fast you are, that's going to catch up with you, the doctor chastised. Barry rolled her eyes. Caitlin, seriously, stop treating me like I'm a kid. I'm not. And I'm not Ronnie. So stop acting like you have to take care of me. I don't need it. There was a moment's silence before Caitlin spoke again. You're right. You're not. Caitlin rushed out of the cortex and Cisco shook his head, following her. That was uncalled for, Barry, Felicity said, turning to her. Barry rolled her eyes and was about to respond when her phone buzzed. She checked the screen. It's Oliver. He wants another training session. He probably won't shoot you again. Felicity flinched. There was an awkward pause. Maybe you should wear body armor. Barry sighed and raced out of Star Labs. Oliver glanced at his watch again before hearing the sound of footsteps behind him. He shook his head. Late again, Barry, he said, turning to her and frowning. Something about the way she was holding herself was odd. Barry leaned on the slightly broken-down wall and rolled her eyes. Here to yell at me too? Or were you planning on shooting me again? She accused. Oliver's eyes narrowed, but he had a point to make. It was stupid to go after Bivolo alone. You let him get away, he pointed out. Barry's eyes narrowed. Like you have done any better. You fucking let Huntress go, and she knows your identity. Don't even try and pull that shit with me, Ollie, she snapped. Oliver turned fully to face Barry. Something wasn't right. Her eyes looked wrong. He opened his mouth to speak, but Barry apparently wasn't finished. You are such a joke, Ollie. How many people have you killed? How bad did Deathstroke fuck up your city because of you? Oliver flinched slightly. I told Felicity you didn't want my help, he said, shaking his head. Barry turned away from him, nodding as she did. You finally got something right. Barry was gone in a flash of lightning, and Oliver pulled out his phone. He dialed and waited for a moment before the phone was answered. Felicity, something's wrong with Barry. Barry started up the stairs towards her lab when Captain Singh cut her off. Allen, where are we on the Marston case? He demanded. Barry paused on the stairs. I'm working it, she shot back. Captain Singh stepped up the stairs after her, his brow furrowed. I need a better answer than that, Allen. he insisted as she made to head back up the stairs. Barry whirled. I told you I'm working it. Lay off. I work just as hard as anyone else in this building with half the fucking resources. Most of my equipment is broken, and I have to fix it by myself. So, yes, I'm working the case. Barry stormed up the stairs. Joe, who had been one of the crowd who'd witnessed Barry snap at the captain, stepped forward. Sorry, Captain. Barry's having a bad reaction to some medication, Joe assured. Captain Singh glanced after Barry, a slight look of concern flitting across his face. Just get her back under control, the captain insisted. Joe nodded and raced up the stairs to Barry's lab. Joe flinched as Barry finished chewing him out over her father still sitting in Iron Heights. As his daughter's eyes flashed red, she stormed out of her lab and off out of the precinct. Joe's hands were shaking slightly. Those bright red eyes had reminded him a touch too much of the speedster who had stolen Barry's mom's case file from his house and threatened Iris. He sighed and headed out to Star Labs. Felicity nodded and hung up the phone, a frown on her face. That was the Arrow? He says Barry was acting really weird, she said, her hands shaking slightly. Cisco frowned. Weird how? He asked. Angry, Felicity grimaced. There was a tap at the door. Very angry, actually. She snapped at Singh, and me. She's been whammied, Joe pointed out. Caitlin rolled her eyes at the slightly non-scientific term, but stood from her computer. Are we sure she's not just on edge from losing Bigelow? The redhead asked. Joe nodded. I'm sure. I've seen Barry lose fights before. I've never seen her this angry. And her eyes, they flashed red. He explained. Cisco swore. Caitlin nodded. Her healing factor is trying to fight off the effects of Bigelow's powers, but it's only intensifying them, bottling them up. Caitlin reasoned. Dr. Wells nodded. And with anger, that is not a good thing, Wells pointed out. Caitlin nodded emphatically. How the hell do we even begin to try and stop her? The redhead asked, sounding beyond worried. Cold gun would come in real handy right now, Cisco pointed out. Felicity and Caitlin glared at him as Joe made a noise of protest. I'm just saying. Cisco raised his hands defensively. Dr. Wells wheeled forward, shaking his head. No, we're gonna need help for this one. I suggest Felicity call back Oliver Queen. We're gonna need the Arrow, Wells said, turning to the blonde. Felicity's eyes went wide, and she stuttered, but after a moment of shock, she nodded and pulled out her phone.